Struggling farmer helps stranded woman in storm, unaware she owns 1,000s of acres. The rain lashed against Jake Miller's weathered pickup truck as he squinted through the windshield, barely making out the figure huddled by the roadside. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark flashes, revealing a woman in expensive but soaked business attire, her car stuck helplessly in a ditch. Without hesitation, Jake pulled over, offering shelter to the stranger who introduced herself simply as Sarah. In his modest farmhouse, as thunder rolled overhead, he shared his home's warmth and what little food he had, never suspecting that his mysterious guest was Sarah Lancaster, the region's largest landowner, who'd been secretly driving back roads to escape her suffocating corporate life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Miller's weathered hands trembled slightly as he sorted through the stack of overdue notices on his kitchen table. The morning sun filtered through the worn curtains his mother had sewn years ago, casting a gentle light on the mounting evidence of his struggles. 3 bank warnings, 2 equipment payment reminders, and a final notice from the seed supplier. Each piece of paper represented another crack in the foundation of his family's legacy. Rising before dawn was second nature to Jake, just as it had been for his father and grandfather before him. The Miller farm had stood proud for 3 generations, its fertile soil providing not just for their family, but for much of the surrounding community. Now, at 32, Jake carried that responsibility alone, the weight of it evident in the premature creases around his eyes and the perpetual worry line etched across his forehead. He tucked the bills into the old cookie jar his mother used to fill with chocolate chip cookies every Sunday, now a repository for financial burdens rather than sweet treats. The memory of his parents' absence still stung fresh, though it had been 5 years since the accident that took them both on a rainy night, much like the previous evening. Their insurance money had kept the farm afloat initially, but drought and rising costs had steadily eaten away at their savings. Outside, the aftermath of last night's storm painted a familiar scene of challenge. Fallen branches littered the cornfields, and sections of the fence near the old oak tree had collapsed. But there was something different about this morning. The presence of the mysterious woman he'd rescued, now sleeping in his parents' old room upstairs. Jake pulled on his work boots and headed out to begin his daily routine. The chickens needed feeding. The cattle required moving to fresh pasture, and those fence posts wouldn't repair themselves. His neighbors often questioned why he didn't sell to one of the big agricultural corporations that had been buying up local farms. Pride won't fill your belly, Old Man Thompson had warned him last month. But it wasn't just pride, it was promise. He remembered the night before his father's funeral, standing in the barn, his mother's quiet voice carrying through the dusty air. Your father believed in something bigger than profit, Jake. He believed in community, in being the kind of neighbor who shows up when needed, no questions asked. Those words had become his compass, guiding his decisions, even when logic suggested otherwise. The local feed store had extended his credit longer than they should have, and when the Johnsons lost their barn to a fire last year, Jake had been the first to arrive with lumber and helping hands, despite his own scarce resources. That's just what you did in farming country. You helped your neighbors, trusted in better days ahead, and never turned away someone in need. As Jake mended the broken fence, his mind wandered to his unexpected guest. There was something about Sarah that didn't quite add up. Her designer clothes and manicured hands suggested a life far removed from rural hardship. Yet there was an earnestness in her eyes when she'd thanked him for his help, a genuine warmth that transcended social barriers. The morning passed in a blur of physical labor, each task crossing itself off a mental checklist developed over years of routine. Fix the fence, check the irrigation lines damaged by the storm, assess the corn for wind damage, repair the loose shingle on the barn roof. His father used to say that a farmer's work was never done, just temporarily paused. looking at the endless tasks ahead. Jake couldn't help but smile at the truth in those words. Yet despite the mounting challenges, there was peace in this life he'd chosen. The satisfaction of working land that knew his family's footsteps, of watching seeds transform into sustenance, of being part of an unbroken chain of stewardship that stretched back to his grandfather's time. These thoughts sustained him through the hard times, even as the modern world pressed in from all sides, threatening to render his way of life obsolete. Sarah Lancaster awoke to unfamiliar sounds, roosters crowing, wind rustling through trees, and the distant lowing of cattle. For a moment, disoriented in the homey bedroom with its faded floral wallpaper, she forgot how far she'd fled from her usual world of conference calls and shareholder meetings. Just 24 hours ago, she'd been sitting in her corner office on the 30th floor of Lancaster Agricultural Holdings, staring at a spreadsheet of properties their company had acquired over the past quarter. Each number represented another family farm absorbed into their corporate empire, another piece of rural America transformed into industrial agriculture. Her father's voice still echoed in her head. "Sentiment doesn't feed the world, Sarah. Efficiency does." The morning's board meeting had been the breaking point. They wanted her to oversee the acquisition of another 50 small farms in the region, including several that had been in families for generations. "It's just business," they'd said, but the weight of responsibility had become suffocating. Being the youngest CEO in the company's history meant constantly proving herself, making the hard decisions that looked good on quarterly reports, but felt increasingly hollow. She'd walked out of that meeting, ignored her assistant's protests, and grabbed her car keys. No security detail, no corporate driver, just her and the open road. She'd done this before, these secret drives through the countryside their company was reshaping, but never during a storm, never this far from the familiar routes. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now found herself dependent on the very kind of person her company routinely displaced. Jake Miller, with his calloused hands and honest eyes, represented everything the corporate spreadsheets ignored. The human element, the generational knowledge, the deep connection to the land that couldn't be quantified in profit margins. Sarah sat up in bed, running her fingers over the handmade quilt that had kept her warm through the night. Everything in this room told a story. The worn dresser with its mismatched handles, the family photos in simple frames, the hand-crocheted doilies on the bedside table. Such a contrast to her minimalist penthouse apartment where everything was chosen for its design value rather than its history. Her phone lay dead on the nightstand, a blessing in disguise. No doubt her office was in chaos, her absence setting off a chain of contingency protocols. The last time she'd taken an unplanned day off was 3 years ago when her mother passed away. Even then, she'd managed the funeral arrangements between conference calls. "Lancaster women are made of steel," her father had said at the service, as if praising a business acquisition rather than mourning his wife. The smell of coffee drifted up from downstairs, along with the sound of movement in the kitchen. Her designer suit, now clean and dried by the furnace overnight, hung on a hook by the door. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt reluctant to put on her corporate armor. Here, in this farmhouse that had weathered generations, she was just Sarah, not Sarah Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster Agricultural Holdings, not the agricultural queen, as the business magazines had dubbed her, not the heartless corporate raider. Her critics claimed she was. Through the window, she watched Jake moving across the farmyard, already deep into his morning's work. There was a grace to his movements, a surety that came from knowing exactly who he was and where he belonged. When was the last time she'd felt that kind of certainty? The mergers, acquisitions, and corporate maneuvering that filled her days seemed suddenly empty compared to the tangible reality of what he was building and maintaining here. Her temporary sanctuary wouldn't last. Reality would eventually intrude with all its demands and expectations. But for now, in this moment suspended between her worlds, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life, one where success wasn't measured in square footage acquired or profit margins expanded, but in the simple satisfaction of working with your hands and knowing your place in the world. The old farmhouse creaked under the storm's assault as Jake stirred a pot of homemade vegetable soup on the stovetop. He'd apologized 3 times already for the humble meal, but Sarah found herself captivated by the simple domesticity of the scene. The way he'd carefully chopped the vegetables from his own garden, the practiced ease with which he moved around the kitchen, the warm aroma filling the air. "My mother's recipe," he explained, testing the broth with a wooden spoon that had seen years of use. "Nothing fancy, but it'll warm you up." Lightning flashed outside, followed by a rumble that seemed to shake the windows in their frames. "Looks like you'll be stuck here a while longer. Roads out here flood pretty quick." Sarah sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in one of Jake's old flannel shirts that he'd insisted she wear after her clothes were hung to dry. "I really can't thank you enough," she said, watching him work. "Most people wouldn't stop for a stranger." In weather like this, Jake's laugh was warm and genuine. "Out here, we don't believe in strangers, just friends we haven't met yet. At least that's what my dad always said." He ladled the soup into 2 mismatched bowls, the ceramic worn smooth from years of use. "Though I admit, we don't get many visitors in business suits around these parts." Sarah accepted the bowl gratefully, conscious of how her manicured nails contrasted with the rustic pottery. "I was taking a drive to clear my head. Guess I should have checked the weather forecast first." The half-truth tasted bitter on her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to reveal her identity. Not yet. Not when he was looking at her with such unguarded kindness. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, interrupted only by the storm's percussion on the roof. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd had a meal this simple yet satisfying. Her usual dinners were business affairs in upscale restaurants, every bite calculated for its networking potential. "Tell me about the farm," she found herself asking, genuinely curious. "How long has your family been here?" Jake's eyes lit up, and he launched into stories about his grandfather breaking the land, his father introducing new crops, and his own dreams for the future. His passion was evident in every word, though she caught hints of worry when he mentioned recent challenges. Sarah felt her chest tighten, knowing her company was partly responsible for the economic pressures facing farmers like Jake. As the evening wore on, they moved to the living room. Jake built a fire in the old brick fireplace, its warm light dancing across walls covered in family photos. Sarah found herself drawn to them. 3 generations of millers, their faces weathered but proud, standing before the same field she could hear the rain pelting now. "That's my mom and dad," Jake said softly, noticing her interest in a particular photo, taken about a month before the accident. His voice carried a weight that made Sarah turn. In the firelight, she could see the loss etched in his features, a pain that even 5 years hadn't fully healed. "They look like wonderful people," she offered, meaning it. The couple in the photo radiated the same genuine warmth she'd experienced from their son. They were. Jake settled into his father's old armchair, its leather cracked but well-loved. Mom could make anyone feel like family within 5 minutes of meeting them. Dad never met a problem he couldn't fix with enough patience and hard work. He smiled at the memory. "They taught me everything I know about running this place, but more importantly, about doing right by people." The conversation flowed naturally from there, touching on childhood memories, favorite seasons on the farm, and hopes for the future. Sarah found herself sharing carefully edited versions of her own life, focusing on her love of the countryside and her growing dissatisfaction with corporate culture. Each time thunder crashed outside, she felt oddly grateful for the storm that had brought her here. As the evening grew late, Jake showed her to his parents' old room, now a guest room that still held echoes of its former occupants. "Bathrooms. Down the hall if you need it," he said. "Extra blankets in the chest if you get cold. We lose power sometimes in storms like this, but the generator usually kicks in." Standing in the doorway, Sarah felt an unexpected reluctance to end their evening. In just a few hours, this stranger had shown her more genuine kindness than she'd experienced in years of business dealings. "Jake," she called as he turned to leave, "thank you, not just for the rescue, but for everything." He smiled, that warm, unguarded smile that made her heart skip. "Get some rest, Sarah. Tomorrow's another day." As he headed to his own room, Sarah stood for a moment in the doorway, listening to the rain and wondering how she would ever return to her own world after experiencing this one. Dawn broke with no relief from the storm. If anything, the weather had worsened overnight, transforming the dirt roads into muddy rivers and filling the air with the constant drumming of rain. Jake stood at the kitchen window, cell phone in hand, frowning at the no-signal message that flashed persistently on the screen. "Towers must be down," he explained as Sarah descended the stairs, her borrowed clothes making her look surprisingly at home in the farmhouse setting. "Landline's dead too. Happens sometimes during storms like this." He hesitated, watching her reaction carefully. "I hate to say it, but you might be stuck here for a while. The creek tends to flood the access road when we get rain like this." Sarah felt a mixture of panic and relief at the news. Her corporate world would be in chaos without her, but something about this forced pause felt like a gift. "I understand," she said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "I hope I'm not imposing too much." "Not at all," Jake replied, already moving to the stove where coffee percolated in an old enamel pot. "Though I should warn you, farm work doesn't stop for weather. Hope you don't mind getting your hands dirty." The next few hours proved just how literal that warning was. Despite the rain, the animals needed tending, and Jake had to check for storm damage. Sarah found herself holding an umbrella over his head as he repaired a broken section of the chicken coop, her designer watch forgotten as she handed him tools, and learned the difference between a Phillips and flathead screwdriver. "You're a quick study," Jake commented as she successfully hammered a nail into place. "Most city folks I know wouldn't go near a toolbox." Sarah thought of her ergonomic office, a chair and manicured nails with a touch of irony. "Maybe I missed my calling," she joked, though the words held more truth than she cared to admit. By midday, they were both soaked, despite their rain gear. Jake insisted they head inside to warm up, and Sarah found herself in the cozy kitchen, once again, this time helping to prepare lunch. She watched in fascination as Jake transformed simple ingredients, bread he'd baked himself, cheese from a local dairy, and homegrown tomatoes, into grilled sandwiches that put her usual catered. "Lunches to shame. The power's holding for now," Jake said as they ate, "but we should probably prepare in case it goes out. Would you mind helping me check the emergency supplies?" The task took them to the cellar, where generations of millers had stored provisions. Sarah held the flashlight as Jake inventoried candles, batteries, and canned goods. In the beam's narrow light, their shoulders occasionally brushed, sending unexpected sparks of awareness through them both. "My father would be proud," Jake said suddenly, his voice soft in the dim space. "He always said a farmer's duty was to help travelers in need. Guess he never specified they had to be from around here." Sarah felt the weight of her deception press against her chest. Here was this man, opening his home and sharing his world, with complete trust, while she held back the truth of who she was. But as she watched him methodically checking supplies, she realized she was seeing the real Jake Miller, not just a struggling farmer to be bought out, but a man of substance and character. The afternoon passed in a blur of small tasks and comfortable conversation. Jake taught her how to play checkers on his father's old board, and Sarah found herself sharing stories of her childhood dreams, carefully edited to exclude the corporate empire she'd inherited. The storm raged outside, but within the farmhouse. Walls, a different kind of energy was building. As evening approached, they stood together at the window, watching sheets of rain transform the landscape. "You know," Jake said thoughtfully, "sometimes the worst storms bring unexpected blessings." He glanced at her, then quickly away, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, knowing she was standing on the edge of something both wonderful and dangerous. because sooner or later the storm would end, and with it this precious bubble of simplicity would burst. But for now, stranded together in this timeless farmhouse, she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of future, one where spreadsheets and profit margins didn't dictate every decision, where success was measured in moments of genuine connection rather than quarterly reports. Morning light filtered through breaking clouds, revealing puddles that dotted the farmyard like mirrors. The storm had finally begun to ease, but its aftermath was everywhere. Fallen branches, scattered debris, and mud-slicked paths that made every step treacherous. Sarah stood on the porch, cradling a cup of coffee, watching Jake assess the damage with a practiced eye. "Could have been worse," he muttered, more to himself than to her. At least the main barn roof held. But Sarah caught the worry in his voice, saw how his gaze lingered on the damaged irrigation system that would need costly repairs. "I want to help," she found herself saying, setting down her coffee cup. "Show me what needs to be done." Jake looked at her, really looked at her, taking in her borrowed jeans and determined expression. "Farm work isn't exactly gentle on the hands," he warned, though a smile tugged at his lips. "These hands could use some honest work," she replied, thinking of all the documents they'd signed condemning family farms to corporate takeover. The morning unfolded in a series of revelations. Sarah learned the rhythm of feeding animals, the satisfaction of mucking out stalls, the careful attention needed to check fence lines for damage. But the most striking revelations came in quiet moments between tasks. She noticed how Jake tracked every expenditure in a worn notebook, calculating and recalculating with increasing frustration. A parts bill for the tractor lay open on his desk. The amount would have been pocket change to her corporation, but she could see how it weighed on him. "The bank's not being particularly understanding," he admitted during a water break, wiping sweat from his brow. "They don't see the value in family farms anymore. Everything's about efficiency and scale now." Sarah felt each word like a physical blow, knowing her company's role in creating that reality. But surely the history, the knowledge passed down through generations, that has to count for something. Jake's laugh held no humor. "Try telling that to the corporations buying up everything in sight. Lancaster Agricultural Holdings." Sarah flinched at the name. "They've been especially aggressive lately. Bought the Peterson place last month. Third-generation farm gone just like that." "What would you do?" Sarah asked carefully, her heart pounding. "If you had the resources, I mean, what would you change?" His eyes lit up with passion, and she saw the leader he could be, given the chance. "Modernize sustainably," he said without hesitation. "Implement better irrigation systems, invest in soil conservation, maybe even start a co-op with neighboring farms to share equipment costs. But keep the soul of the place intact, the connection to the land, the sense of community." The plans he outlined were surprisingly sophisticated, revealing a mind that understood both tradition and innovation. Sarah found herself taking mental notes, seeing possibilities she'd never considered in her corporate strategy meetings. As they worked together to clear fallen branches, Jake shared more about the community, how farmers helped each other during hard times, how knowledge and resources were shared freely. It was everything her company's efficiency models ignored, everything she'd been taught to consider obsolete. But there was nothing obsolete about the way this farm operated. Despite its financial struggles, she could see the sustainable practices Jake had implemented, the careful stewardship of resources, the long-term thinking that corporate quarterly reports never captured. "You're different than I expected," Jake said, suddenly pausing in his work. "Most city folk see a farm and think it's simple, but you actually understand, don't you?" Sarah met his gaze, feeling the weight of her deception even as warmth bloomed in her chest at his words. "I'm learning too," she said softly, "thanks to you." The morning's physical labor had left her muscles aching, her clothes mud-stained, and her manicure ruined. But watching Jake move through his world with such purpose and pride, seeing the intelligence and care behind every decision he made, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. the corporate executive who measured success in acquisitions and profit. Margins was being challenged by the woman who had spent a morning discovering the true value of things that couldn't be counted in dollars and cents. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, turning water droplets into diamonds across the rain-washed fields. Sarah followed Jake through rows of corn, learning to assess storm damage with an expert's eye. Her corporate suits and boardroom presentations felt like memories from another life as she immersed herself in this hands-on education. "See how the stalks are bent but not broken," Jake demonstrated, gently straightening a corn plant. "They're more resilient than they look. Nature has a way of building strength through flexibility." His hands moved with practiced care, and Sarah found herself watching them, fascinated by their capability and gentleness. "Like farmers," she said softly, thinking of all the adaptations Jake had made to keep his farm viable. He looked up, surprise and something warmer flickering in his eyes at her understanding. They worked in companionable silence, moving down the rows together. Sarah's muscles ached from the unfamiliar labor, but she welcomed the pain. It felt honest, earned, so different from the tension headaches that plagued her corporate life. "You're a natural," Jake commented, as she successfully identified another damaged section. "Most people take years to develop an eye for this." Pride bloomed in her chest at his words, even as guilt twisted beneath it. If he knew who she really was. The morning evolved into a series of practical lessons. Jake taught her how to check soil drainage, explain crop rotation patterns, and identify early signs of trouble in the plants. His knowledge was deep and intuitive, passed down through generations, but enhanced by his own research and innovations. "Dad always said farming was equal parts science and soul," he explained, as they took a water break in the shade of an old oak tree. "You need the technical knowledge, sure, but you also need to feel the rhythm of the land." Sarah thought of the countless agricultural reports on her desk, the satellite imagery and yield projections. None of them captured this, the living, breathing reality of a working farm. "Your father sounds like a wise man," she said. He was. Jake's voice softened with memory. "Would have liked you, I think. He always appreciated people who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty." The compliment warmed her even as it stung. Her hands were dirty now, yes, but what about the clean, manicured hands that had signed orders displacing farmers like Jake? Later, as they worked on repairing a section of irrigation piping, their hands brushed accidentally. The simple contact sent electricity through them both, causing a momentary pause in their work. Sarah looked up to find Jake watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "We make a good team," he said quietly, and she could hear all the unspoken possibilities in those words. "We do," she agreed, her heart racing. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to confess everything, her identity, her company's role in the farming crisis, her growing feelings for him. But fear held her back. Fear of seeing his warm gaze turn cold, of losing this connection that felt more real than anything in her corporate life. As the afternoon wore on, they tackled more repairs together. Jake explained his vision for sustainable farming practices, his voice animated with passion. Sarah found herself offering suggestions, drawn from her business experience, carefully masked as theoretical ideas. "You've got a good head for this," Jake observed. "Ever thought about going into agricultural management?" Sarah nearly laughed at the irony. Instead, she focused on securing a loose pipe fitting. "Maybe in another life," she said, the truth hiding in plain sight. The sun was setting when they finally called it a day, their work visible in the restored order across the farm. Standing together on the porch, surveying their accomplishments, Sarah felt simultaneously more herself and more lost than ever. She was falling for this man and his way of life, even as her hidden identity threatened to destroy everything building between them. The rumble of approaching trucks broke the morning quiet. Sarah was helping Jake sort through damaged crops when 3 mud-splattered pickups pulled into the farmyard. Her heart rate spiked. Had someone recognized her? But Jake's welcoming smile told a different story. "The cavalry's arrived," he said warmly, waving to the arriving farmers. "After storms like this, we check on each other. Guess it's our turn first." Old man Thompson emerged from the first truck, his weathered face creased with concern. Behind him came the Martinez family from the neighboring dairy farm and the young Wilson couple who'd recently taken over his father's old place. Each carried tools and supplies, ready to help without being asked. "Heard you had a visitor during the storm," Thompson said, eyeing Sarah with friendly curiosity. "Hope Jake's been showing proper hospitality." "The best," Sarah replied, surprising herself with how naturally she fell into conversation with them. These were the people her company's reports reduced to statistics and acquisition targets. Now they had faces, names, stories. The group split into teams to tackle the storm damage. Sarah worked alongside Maria Martinez, learning how the farming community functioned like an extended family. They shared equipment, knowledge, and labor freely, supporting each other through hard times. "Last year, when our milk truck broke down," Maria explained as they cleared debris, "Jake lent us his without hesitation, saved our whole week's production. That's just how things work out here." Sarah watched Jake directing the repair efforts, noting how naturally he led without dominating. He knew exactly when to defer to Thompson's experience or the Wilsons' fresh ideas. It was a kind of leadership her corporate training had never covered. "The Lancaster company offered to buy us out last month," young Tom Wilson mentioned during their water break, not noticing how Sarah tensed. "Offered good money too, but after seeing how this community works together," he shook his head. "Some things are worth more than a big check." Sarah found herself drawn into discussions about crop rotation, sustainable practices, and innovative farming techniques. These weren't the backward rural farmers her board meetings dismissed. They were sophisticated agricultural entrepreneurs, combining generations of knowledge with modern methods. The conversation turned to recent corporate buyouts in the region. Sarah listened with a growing sense of discomfort as they discussed her company's tactics. It was one thing to read acquisition reports, another entirely to hear the human cost in their voices. "Speaking of Lancasters," Thompson said suddenly, "anyone seen the news about their CEO going missing?" Sarah nearly dropped the tool she was holding. "My daughter showed me on her phone. Sarah Lancaster disappeared 2 days ago, boards in an uproar. Probably sitting on some beach with her millions," Tom Wilson joked, but Jake frowned. "Maybe she needed a break," he said thoughtfully. "Can't be easy carrying that kind of responsibility." Sarah turned away, her face burning. If they only knew she was standing right there, wearing borrowed clothes, her hands dirty from honest work. The irony was almost unbearable. As the day progressed, Sarah saw countless small examples of community in action. Thompson sharing news about grain prices, Maria offering advice about equipment maintenance, the Wilsons discussing new organic farming techniques they'd researched. Every interaction reinforced the invisible bonds holding this community together. By late afternoon, the major repairs were complete. The farmers gathered for a simple meal of sandwiches and homemade lemonade, sharing stories and laughter. Sarah found herself drawn into their circle, included without question or hesitation. "You've got good instincts," Thompson told her as they finished up. "Ever considered taking up farming?" The question hit too close to home. Sarah managed a smile, even as her chest tightened with the weight of her deception. "I'm learning that there's a lot more to it than I ever realized." As they watched the trucks depart, Jake turned to her with pride and something deeper in his eyes. "Now you've seen how it really works out here. Not just the farming, but the people. It's what these corporate types never understand. You can't put a price on community." Sarah had never felt more torn. She was the very corporate type he spoke of, yet standing here covered in dirt and surrounded by the evidence of real community in action, she felt her carefully constructed worldview crumbling. The Sarah Lancaster who had driven down these back roads in an expensive car just days ago seemed like a stranger now. The next morning brought unwelcome discoveries. What had seemed like manageable storm damage now revealed itself as something far more serious. Jake stood at the edge of his lower field, his face grim as he surveyed the waterlogged crops. The irrigation system's failure during the storm had left parts of the field flooded, while others remained dangerously dry. "If we don't fix this today, we'll lose at least 30% of the crop," he said, running calculations in his head. Sarah could see the weight of potential failure pressing down on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one season's profits. It was about survival. "Tell me what to do," she said, stepping up beside him. The corporate world had taught her to handle crisis management. Surely those skills could translate to this. They worked frantically through the morning, racing against time and sun exposure. Jake taught her to identify which plants could be saved and which were already lost. Each decision carried the weight. Of financial consequences she understood all too well, though from a vastly different perspective. "The pump system's shot," Jake announced, emerging from the irrigation control shed. His face had the careful blankness of someone trying to hide devastation. "Parts alone will cost more than I can spare right now." Sarah knew exactly how much such repairs would cost. Her company's acquisition reports always detailed such infrastructure requirements. The amount would be negligible to Lancaster Agricultural Holdings, but it was clearly overwhelming to Jake. "What about a temporary fix?" she suggested, thinking quickly. "Maybe we could, together." They devised a makeshift solution, using materials from the barn and Jake's knowledge of water flow patterns. It wasn't pretty, but it might save enough crops to make a difference. As they worked, Sarah found herself sharing business principles that could help: inventory management, risk assessment, strategic planning, all carefully framed as theoretical knowledge rather than executive experience. "You know," Jake said as they finished securing a crucial pipe connection, "you've got a real head for this. The way you think about problems, seeing both the immediate crisis and the longer-term implications." He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's impressive." His praise felt like glass in her heart. Every solution she offered came from the very corporate experience that threatened farms like his. Every bit of knowledge she shared had been gained in boardrooms, where family farms were seen as inefficient obstacles to progress. The afternoon brought another crisis, when they discovered mold beginning to form in sections of the grain storage. The recent humidity had created perfect conditions for crop destruction. Jake's face went pale at the sight. This could ruin him if left unchecked. "We can't lose this grain," he said quietly. "The bank won't wait much longer as it is." Sarah's mind raced. She knew modern grain management techniques that could help, but explaining how she knew them would raise questions she couldn't answer. Still, watching Jake face potential ruin, she couldn't stay silent. "What if we tried industrial ventilation techniques?" she suggested carefully. "I've read about them." Jake looked at her curiously, but was too focused on the crisis to question her knowledge. They spent hours implementing her suggestions, adapting corporate techniques to their limited resources. It was exhausting, detailed work, but by sunset, they had the situation under control. Sitting on the porch steps that evening, both physically drained but satisfied with their progress, Sarah felt the full weight of her deception. Here was a man who had welcomed her into his home, shared his knowledge, and trusted her completely. She was helping him save his farm while being part of the system threatening to destroy it. "Thank you," Jake said suddenly, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "I couldn't have managed all this alone." He turned to look at her, his expression open and vulnerable. "It's strange. I feel like I've known you much longer than just a few days." Sarah met his gaze, seeing everything she was coming to love about this life reflected in his eyes. The honesty, the dedication, the deep connection to the land and community. Her response caught in her throat, because the truth was, she was starting to feel more real, more herself in these few days than in years of corporate success. "Jake, she began, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that the woman he was coming to know was both more and less real than her. True identity? That helping him save his farm had shown her everything wrong with her company's approach? The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken truths and growing feelings. Above them, stars began to appear in the clearing sky, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. Sarah had never felt more torn between two worlds, knowing that eventually she would have to choose. Evening settled over the farm like a gentle blanket, bringing with it a peace Sarah had never known in her corporate life. She sat at Jake's kitchen table, watching him prepare dinner from ingredients grown in his own garden. The simple domesticity of the scene touched something deep within her. "My mother taught me that food tastes better when it's shared," Jake said, sliding a freshly baked loaf of bread from the oven. The aroma filled the kitchen, making Sarah's mouth water. "Though, I'll admit I don't usually have anyone to share it with." "Their loss," Sarah said softly, meaning it. The Jake Miller she'd come to know over these past days was nothing like the stubborn, backward farmer depicted in her company's reports. He was thoughtful, intelligent, and possessed a quiet strength that drew her like a magnet. They worked together to set the table, moving around each other with an ease that felt surprisingly natural. Jake had made a simple pasta dish with homegrown tomatoes and herbs, but to Sarah it looked more appealing than any five-star restaurant meal. "Tell me about your dreams," she found herself asking as they ate. "If money wasn't an issue, what would you do with this place?" Jake's eyes lit up with passion. "First, I'd modernize the irrigation system, but sustainably. Solar-powered pumps, water recycling, the works." He grabbed a napkin and started sketching ideas. "Then I'd start an educational program. Get kids out here, show them where their food comes from, maybe partner with local schools." Sarah leaned closer, fascinated. His vision was remarkably aligned with the sustainable agriculture initiatives she'd been trying to push through her board, initiatives that had been repeatedly shot down as unprofitable. "The thing is," Jake continued, "farming's not just about production, it's about stewardship. We're not just growing crops, we're preserving knowledge, protecting the land for future generations." He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "Probably sounds silly to you." "No," Sarah said quickly, her heart aching. "It sounds perfect." After dinner, they moved to the porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. Jake brought out an old photo album, sharing stories of his family's history on the farm. Each photograph revealed another layer of the legacy he was fighting to preserve. "This was my great-grandfather's first tractor," he explained, pointing to a sepia-toned image. "He bought it second-hand, worked extra jobs for 2 years to pay it off. That tractor helped build everything you see here." Sarah thought of the vintage tractor she'd bought as office decoration for Lancaster Agricultural Holdings headquarters. A meaningless prop meant to add rustic charm to their corporate image. The contrast made her stomach turn. "You know, what's funny," Jake said, turning another page. "Everyone thinks farming is just about the past, about tradition, but it's really about the future. Every seed we plant, every decision we make, affects what happens years down the line." "I'm starting to understand that," Sarah replied, thinking of how her company's short-term profit focus was destroying generations of agricultural knowledge and expertise. As the evening wore on, their conversation drifted to personal dreams and fears. Jake spoke about his hopes for the farm's future, his desire to make his parents proud. Sarah shared carefully edited versions of her own struggles with family expectations and corporate pressure. "Sometimes I feel trapped," she admitted, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "Like I'm playing a role that doesn't quite fit anymore." Jake's hand found hers in the darkness, warm and calloused. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said quietly. "Realizing the role doesn't fit is the first step to finding one that does." The simple wisdom of his words struck her deeply. In her corporate life, Sarah had always believed she was working towards something meaningful, modernizing agriculture, improving efficiency. But sitting here, experiencing the reality of farm life and community, she was beginning to question everything. "Jake," she started, her heart pounding. The weight of her secret felt unbearable in this moment of intimacy. But before she could continue, he squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to explain anything," he said softly. "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. What matters is where those turns lead us." Sarah looked at their intertwined hands. His, tanned and work-roughened, hers still showing traces of her corporate manicure. Two worlds meeting, connecting, possibly changing each other. She'd never felt more torn between who she was and who she was becoming. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the storm's aftermath giving way to perfect early light. Sarah found Jake in the barn, where golden sunbeams cut through dust motes and highlighted his profile as he worked on repairing an old tractor. She paused in the doorway, struck by the peace of the moment. "Morning," he called, looking up with a smile that made her heart skip. "Hope I didn't wake you with all this clanking?" "No, I was already up," she said, walking over. "Need a hand?" Jake's eyebrows rose in amusement. "You know anything about tractors? I'm a quick study, remember?" She picked up a wrench, their fingers brushing as he showed her which bolts needed tightening. The simple contact sent electricity through them both. They worked together in comfortable silence, the kind that builds between people who no longer need words to understand each other. Sarah found herself studying his face when he wasn't looking. The concentration in his eyes, the slight furrow of his brow as he focused on a particularly stubborn part. "There," Jake said finally, wiping his hands on a rag. "Should run smoother now." He turned to her, his expression softening. "You've got a little—" He reached out, gently wiping a smudge of grease from her cheek. Time seemed to stop. His hand lingered on her face, and Sarah found herself leaning into his touch. The morning sun wrapped around them like a cocoon, the rest of the world fading away. Jake's eyes dropped to her lips, and she felt herself drawing closer, drawn by an invisible force neither could resist. Then came the sound that shattered everything. The sudden chirp of a cell phone coming back to life. They jumped apart as if burned. Sarah's phone, forgotten in her pocket for days, had finally found a signal. The screen lit up with a cascade of notifications. 47 missed calls, 156 messages, 89 emails. The real world came crashing back with brutal force. "Sounds like someone's been trying to reach you," Jake said quietly, his tone carefully neutral. Sarah's hands shook as she silenced the device. "It's not... I should probably... check your messages." Jake finished for her, already stepping back, creating physical distance to match the emotional gulf that had suddenly opened between them. "Of course! Take all the time you need." She fled to the safety of the house, her heart pounding. In the guest room, she finally looked at her phone properly. The messages were a litany of corporate crisis, emergency board meeting, stock prices dropping, media speculation about your disappearance, legal implications of CEO abandonment. One message from her father stood out. "Whatever game you're playing, Sarah, it ends now. The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your replacement. Don't throw away everything we've built." She sank onto the bed, the phone slipping from her numb fingers. The fantasy of the past few days, of a simpler life, of genuine connection, of possibly finding a way to bridge her two worlds, seemed to crumble in the face of reality. Through the window she could see Jake back at work, his movements more mechanical now, the easy grace of their shared morning lost. He looked up once, catching her watching, and offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sarah pressed her hand against the cool glass, feeling tears threaten. She had known this moment would come, had known her corporate life would eventually intrude, but she hadn't expected it to hurt quite so much. The phone chirped again. Another message, another demand for her attention. But all she could think about was the warmth of Jake's hand on her cheek, the look in his eyes just before the moment shattered, the future that had seemed possible in that suspended moment of time. Down in the barn, Jake picked up his tools. and resumed working, his movements betraying a tension that hadn't been there before. The distance between them now felt greater than the few yards separating house from barn. It was the distance between two different worlds, two different lives, and Sarah had no idea how to bridge it. The almost kiss hung in the air between them, a moment of possibility now tainted by the intrusion of her other life. Sarah touched her cheek where Jake's hand had been, wondering how something that felt so right could be complicated by so many lies. The local diner's bell chimed as Jake pushed open the door, Sarah following close behind. After the tension of the morning, he had suggested they grab lunch in town, a chance to reset their suddenly awkward dynamic. But as they entered, Sarah immediately sensed something was different. The usual friendly chatter dulled to curious whispers, and several patrons were hunched over newspapers. "Jake, your usual?" Betty, the elderly waitress, called out, then noticed Sarah. Her eyes widened slightly as she glanced between Sarah and something on the counter. Today's newspaper, Sarah realized with growing dread. "Two specials, please, Betty," Jake replied, leading Sarah to a corner booth. He seemed oblivious to the attention they were drawing, but Sarah noticed every stolen glance, every whispered conversation. From their seat, she could just make out the headline on a discarded paper: "Lancaster Ag CEO missing, board threatens replacement." Below it was a photo from her last press conference. Her corporate smile and perfect suit, a stark contrast to her current borrowed clothes and wind-tossed hair. Quite a story, isn't it? A middle-aged farmer at the next table leaned over, newspaper in hand. "Says here she just vanished. No note, no nothing. Board's in an uproar." He shook his head. "These corporate types thinking they can just play with people's livelihoods." Jake frowned. "Tom, that's a bit harsh. We don't know her situation." "Don't we?" Tom countered. "Lancaster Agricultural's been buying up farms all over the county. Mitchell's place last month, Peterson's before that. Now their CEO goes AWOL? Something ain't right." Sarah stared at her menu, her hands shaking slightly. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead as more locals joined the conversation. "My cousin works for their regional office," someone added. "Says she's been acting strange for months, questioning company policies, holding up acquisitions." "I heard she had a breakdown," another voice chimed in. "Pressure got to her." "Well, I hope wherever she is, she's getting a good look at the damage her company's doing," Tom said firmly. "Maybe then she'll understand what these corporate takeovers mean to real folks." Jake's voice cut through the gossip, surprisingly sharp. "That's enough. Whatever's going on with her, it's not our business to judge." Sarah looked at him gratefully, even as guilt twisted in her stomach. His defense of a woman he thought he didn't know made her deception feel even heavier. Betty arrived, with their food, along with her own piece of gossip. Channel 4 News van was out by the Lancaster offices this morning. They're saying the board's meeting tomorrow to vote on her replacement. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. Jake looked at her with concern. "You okay?" "Just tired," she managed. "It's been a long few days." The diner's door chimed again, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. A well-dressed man in a suit, so out of place in the rural diner, stepped in, looking around carefully. She recognized him instantly, Robert Chen, her company's head of security. Without thinking, Sarah slid lower in her seat, turning her face away. Jake noticed her reaction but said nothing, smoothly adjusting his position to better shield her from view. Robert surveyed the diner briefly before approaching the counter. "Excuse me," she heard him say. "I'm looking for information about Sarah Lancaster. We have reason to believe she might have passed through this area." The diner grew quiet. Sarah held her breath, aware of every creak of the old building's floorboards, every clink of coffee cups. "Ain't seen her," Betty replied flatly. Something in the older woman's tone made Sarah look up. Betty was staring directly at her, a knowing look in her eyes. Then the waitress turned back to Robert. "But if I do, I'll be sure to let her know you're looking for her." The response around the diner was immediate. A chorus of "haven't seen her" and "no strangers around here" rose up. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes, recognizing the community's instinctive protection of one of their own, even if they didn't realize who she really was. Robert lingered for a few more minutes, leaving his card on the counter before departing. The bell's cheerful ring seemed to mock the tension he left behind. Jake waited until the security chief's car disappeared down the road before speaking. Ready to head back? His voice was gentle, but Sarah could hear the unasked questions in it. The drive home was quiet, heavy with words unsaid. Sarah watched the familiar farmland roll past, knowing her time in this simpler world was running out. The board meeting tomorrow would force her hand one way or another. As they pulled into Jake's driveway, he finally broke the silence. You know, whoever she is, whatever her reasons, sometimes people need space to figure things out, to remember who they really are. Sarah turned to him, her heart breaking at the understanding in his eyes. She wondered if he had guessed her secret, if he was offering her a chance to come clean. But before she could find the words, the moment passed, leaving only the weight of unspoken truths between them. Dawn painted the farmhouse in gentle gold, but there was nothing gentle about the way Jake stared at the newspaper in his hands. The morning delivery had come early, and with it, the truth Sarah had been desperately trying to hide. There, on the front page, was a full-color photo of Sarah Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster Agricultural Holdings, looking polished and professional at a recent corporate event. The resemblance to his housiguest was unmistakable, despite her current borrowed clothes and casual appearance. He heard her footsteps on the stairs before he saw her. Sarah, the woman he'd come to care for deeply over the past few days, stopped dead in the doorway when she saw the paper in his hands. "Jake," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "I can explain." He looked up, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Can you?" "Because I'm having a hard time understanding how the CEO of the company buying up all our farms has been living in my house, watching me struggle, letting me pour my heart out about saving this place." Sarah took a step forward, but stopped when Jake flinched back. "It wasn't like that. I never meant to—" "To what?" His voice was quiet, but it cut like steel. "To lie? To spy on us? To gather intelligence about which farms to target next?" "No!" The denial burst from her with such force that they both startled. "I ran away because I couldn't stand what we were doing anymore. I needed to understand, to see the reality behind all those acquisition reports." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Well, congratulations. You got your reality show, got to play farmer for a few days, see how the simple folk live." He stood up, the paper crumpling in his grip. "Was it everything you hoped for? Got enough material for your next board meeting?" Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "You don't understand. These past few days have changed everything. Seeing this place, working beside you, understanding what these farms really mean to the community." "Save it," Jake cut her off. "You're Sarah Lancaster. Your company has been systematically destroying family farms across 3 states. The Thompson place, the Wilson's neighbors, the Peterson dairy farm, all gone because of decisions you made in your corner office. Decisions I'm trying to change." Sarah moved closer, desperate to make him understand. "Jake, everything I've learned here, everything you've shown me, it's opened my eyes. I can use my position to make real changes, to find a way to preserve family farms while still modernizing agriculture." "Right," Jake scoffed. "And I'm sure the board will love hearing how their CEO went native during her little countryside vacation." He turned away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "God, I feel like such a fool. All those moments we shared, all those conversations. Was any of it real?" Sarah's heart shattered at the pain in his voice. "All of it," she whispered. "Every moment was real. More real than anything in my life before this." Jake finally turned back to her, his eyes searching her face. "You know, what kills me? I was falling for you. The you I thought you were, this amazing woman who understood farming, who cared about the land and the people on it. But that person doesn't exist, does she? She's just a character you played. She's who I really am." Sarah insisted, taking another step forward. "The corporate CEO, that's the role I've been playing. These past few days, working beside you, learning from you, that's the first time I've felt truly myself in years." For a moment, something flickered in Jake's eyes, a glimmer of the connection they'd shared. But then his gaze fell on the newspaper again, on the corporate portrait of a woman who seemed worlds away from the person standing in his kitchen. "I think you should leave," he said quietly. "Your board meeting's tomorrow, right? Wouldn't want you to lose your empire on account of us simple folk." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. "Jake, please, just go," he repeated, turning his back to her. "I'm sure your company car can find its way back here to collect you. After all, you've probably got the deed to my farm in your filing cabinet already." Sarah stood there, tears flowing freely now, wanting desperately to find the words that would make him understand. But how could she explain that the woman in that newspaper photo no longer existed? That the real Sarah Lancaster had been born here, in his farmhouse, working beside him in the fields. Finally, gathering what remained of her dignity, she walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused. "What you showed me here, what you taught me about farming, about community, about what really matters, it changed everything. I just hope someday you'll believe that." She stepped out into the morning sun, leaving behind not just Jake, but the person she'd become during these precious few days. The screen door banged shut behind her with a finality that felt like the ending of a dream. The sleek black corporate vehicles looked alien against the rural backdrop as they wound their way down the dusty farm road. Sarah watched their approach from the end of Jake's driveway, her heart heavy in her chest. Robert Chen had clearly wasted no time after spotting her at the diner. 3 cars pulled up in a precise formation, 2 SUVs flanking a luxury sedan. The farm's morning quiet was shattered by the sound of car doors opening and closing in practiced synchronization. Sarah straightened her spine, muscle memory from countless board meetings taking over. "Miss Lancaster," Robert stepped forward, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God we found you. The board is in chaos, the press is having a field day, and your father is furious, I imagine." Sarah finished, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. She could see Jake watching from the porch, his face unreadable at this distance. Her assistant, Michelle, emerged from one of the SUVs, tablet in hand. "We have a helicopter standing by at the regional airport. If we leave now, we can make the emergency board meeting." She paused, taking in Sarah's borrowed clothes with barely concealed horror. "I brought your spare suit from the office." The familiar corporate machinery was spinning into action around her, efficient, impersonal, everything she'd run from. But now, with Jake's words still ringing in her ears, it all felt hollow. Miss Lancaster, one of the junior executives, stepped forward. "I have the latest acquisition reports, including the status update on this property." He gestured vaguely toward Jake's farm. "Actually, this could work in our favor. Your unusual vacation has given us valuable insight into—" "Stop." Sarah's command cut through the corporate chatter. "This farm is off limits. In fact, effective immediately, all local acquisition projects are suspended pending review." A shocked silence fell over the group. Michelle's tablet lowered slowly. "But the board, your father, can wait." Sarah turned to Robert. "I need 30 minutes, alone." Miss Lancaster, given the circumstances, 30 minutes, Robert. That's an order. She watched them retreat to their vehicles, then turned toward the farmhouse. Jake still stood on the porch, but now his posture had changed. Tense, defensive. The arrival of the corporate fleet had made everything painfully real. "Quite a circus," he said as she approached, his voice carefully neutral. "Your real world come to claim you. Jake, you know what's funny?" He cut her off, gesturing at the expensive cars. "When I first saw those vehicles, I thought they were here to serve foreclosure papers. Wouldn't be the first family farm brought down by Lancaster Agricultural Holdings." The bitterness in his voice cut deep. "That's not going to happen. Not to your farm, not to any others in this community. I'm stopping it." Jake's laugh was harsh. Right. Because a few days playing farmhand changed your entire corporate philosophy? Wake up, Sarah. The real world doesn't work like that. No, she agreed, surprising him. The real world works exactly like what I've seen here. People supporting each other, working together, building something sustainable. What we've been doing, what my company's been doing, that's the fantasy, thinking we can replace generations of knowledge with corporate efficiency. She stepped closer, heart pounding. I'm not playing anything, Jake. What I learned here, what you showed me, it changed everything, and I'm going to prove it to you. From the cars, Michelle called out anxiously about their timeline. Sarah ignored her, focused entirely on Jake's face, searching for any sign that he believed her. You're really going back there to change things? His voice held a mix of skepticism and something else, a hint of the connection they'd shared. Before truth shattered their bubble. I'm going back to fix things, Sarah corrected, starting with saving the farms we've targeted. It won't be easy. The board will fight me. My father will probably try to have me removed. But I have to try. Jake was silent for a long moment, studying her face. Finally, he spoke softly. The Sarah I got to know these past few days. She was real, wasn't she? She's the most real I've ever been, Sarah whispered. And she's the one going back to that board meeting. The corporate chorus of car engines starting up provided an unwelcome reminder of time running out. Sarah took one last look at the farmhouse, at the fields beyond, at the man who had unknowingly helped her find her true self. I'll prove it to you, Jake, whatever it takes. As she walked back to the waiting cars, Sarah's mind was already racing with plans. She had built Lancaster Agricultural Holdings into a corporate giant. Now she would use that same determination to transform it into something that could work. With family farms, instead of destroying them. She just hoped that by the time she succeeded, it wouldn't be too late for what she and Jake had started to build. Sarah sat in her pristine corner office, 30 floors above the city streets, feeling more isolated than she ever had on Jake's remote farm. The board meeting had been exactly as brutal as she'd expected. Her father's disappointment radiated across the conference table as she presented her new vision for the company. A partnership program with family farms, one board member scoffed. That's not our business model, Sarah. We acquire, we consolidate, we optimize. Our current model is destroying generations of agricultural knowledge, Sarah argued, thinking of Jake's innovative solutions to farm problems. These farmers aren't outdated relics. They're experts in sustainable land management. We should be learning from them, not displacing them. This is business, not charity, another director countered. Our shareholders expect growth. Sarah pulled up a presentation she'd worked on during the helicopter ride. Then let me show you the growth potential in collaborative farming, sustainable practices, reduced environmental impact, premium organic markets. Enough. Her father's voice cut through the discussion. The board will need time to consider these unusual proposals. In the meantime, all acquisition projects remain active. Miles away, Jake stared at his own stack of papers, bank notices, equipment, bills, and a final warning about his mortgage payments. The storm damage had pushed his precarious finances to the breaking point. He'd spent the morning calling other farmers, seeking advice or possibly loans, but everyone was struggling. His hand hovered over the business card Robert Chen had left at the diner. Sarah had promised to help, but could he trust her? Should he? The memory of her in borrowed clothes, working beside him in the fields, felt increasingly like a dream. Back in her office, Sarah pored over acquisition reports with new eyes. Each spreadsheet represented a family farm, a piece of living history. She thought of the Thompsons, the Wilsons, all the farmers she'd met during her time with Jake. Their faces now replaced the sterile numbers on her screen. Your father wanted me to give you this, Michelle said, placing a thick folder on her desk. The latest analysis of underperforming agricultural assets in the region. Sarah opened it to find Jake's farm listed as a prime acquisition target. Her throat tightened as she read the cold assessment of his property's inefficiencies and upgrade potential. Across the countryside, Jake walked his fields, seeing them through Sarah's corporate eyes. Where he saw history and potential, would her board see only outdated methods and missed profits? The irrigation system he'd jury-rigged during the storm was holding, but for how long? "Your daddy would be proud," Old Man Thompson said, stopping his truck by the fence. "Standing your ground, keeping the family legacy alive." Jake managed a smile, though the words stung. Would his father be proud of him considering selling to a corporation? Would he understand that sometimes survival meant compromise? In her high-rise office, Sarah made decision after decision, redirecting resources, restructuring proposals. Each choice felt like a step either toward or away from Jake's world. Her corporate training said efficiency was everything, but her time on the farm had taught her that some forms of value couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. She picked up her phone a dozen times to call Jake, but what would she say? That she was fighting for change but losing, that every mention of his farm in corporate documents made her heart race, that she missed the simple truth of working beside him in the fields. Jake found himself walking to the spot where he'd first found Sarah in the storm. The road was clear now, no trace remaining of that fateful night. He thought of her face when she'd promised to change things, the passion in her voice matching the Sarah he'd known before learning her true identity. But was passion enough to change a corporate giant? As evening fell, they both stood at their respective windows, Sarah looking down at the tiny farms in the distance, Jake looking up at the corporate skyscrapers on the horizon. Each felt the weight of choices yet to be made, paths yet to be chosen. Sarah's assistant interrupted her reverie. "The board's called another emergency meeting for tomorrow. They're voting on the acquisition freeze you proposed." In his farmhouse, Jake picked up the phone and began to dial the number on Robert Chen's card, then stopped. Sometimes choosing a path meant waiting to see where another's path might lead. The boardroom felt more like a battlefield as Sarah faced down 12 stern faces across the polished mahogany table. Her proposal for a radical company restructuring, transforming Lancaster Agricultural Holdings from a corporate acquirer into a farm partnership network, had been met with stony silence. "This is corporate suicide," Victor Matthews, her father's oldest friend and ally, finally spoke. "You're suggesting we abandon a proven business model for some romantic notion of preserving family farms?" Sarah stood her ground, thinking of Jake's innovative solutions to farm problems. "Our current model is unsustainable. These family farms have generations of knowledge we're simply destroying. If we partner with them instead—" "Enough!" Her father's voice cracked like a whip. "Sarah, you disappear for days, throw our company into chaos, and return with this fantasy?" He tossed her proposal aside. "The board has reached a decision. All acquisition projects will proceed as planned, including the Miller farm." Miles away, Jake sat in his truck outside the local bank, gripping a final notice in trembling hands. The loan officer's words still rang in his ears. "Without immediate payment or significant collateral, we'll have to foreclose." He started the engine but didn't drive home. Instead, he found himself parking outside the local diner where everything had changed just days ago. Betty appeared at his side almost immediately with a cup of coffee. "On the house, honey," she said, studying his face. "You look like you could use it." "The bank's calling in the loan," he admitted. Storm damage was the last straw. Back in the city, Sarah's heels clicked against marble floors as she stormed out of the boardroom, her assistant Michelle struggling to keep up. "They can't just dismiss everything I've learned," Sarah fumed. "These farms aren't just balance sheet items. They're the backbone of our agricultural system." "The board disagrees," Michelle said gently, "and they've frozen your executive authority pending a formal review." Sarah stopped short. "They what?" "Your father filed for emergency corporate oversight. Until the review is complete, you can't make any major policy changes." At the diner, Jake stared into his coffee while Betty hovered nearby, concern evident on her face. "You know," she said carefully, "sometimes help comes from unexpected places." Jake laughed bitterly. "Like a corporate CEO pretending to be a stranded traveler. Like someone who saw the truth of what we do out here and wanted to change things," Betty corrected. "Tom told me what happened at the board meeting today. She's fighting for us, Jake. Fighting hard." Jake's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "My niece works in their legal department," Betty explained. "Said Sarah Lancaster presented a complete company restructuring plan. Wanted to turn the whole operation into some kind of partnership program with family farms. Board shut her down cold." In her office, Sarah paced like a caged tiger, her mind racing. The board had blocked her official channels, but she still had connections, resources, maybe enough time to... Her phone buzzed. Another message from the bank managing Jake's loan. They were proceeding with foreclosure preparations. Time was running out. "Michelle," she said suddenly, "get me everything we have on agricultural cooperative structures and call my personal attorney." "Sarah," Michelle hesitated, "the board ordered all staff to..." "The board controls Lancaster Agricultural Holdings," Sarah interrupted, "but they don't control my trust fund or my private investments." At the diner, Jake finally asked the question that had been haunting him. "Do you think she meant it? About wanting to change things?" Betty's response was interrupted by the diner's door chiming. Tom Wilson rushed in, waving a paper. "Jake, you need to see this." It was a financial news website. Print out. The headline read, "Lancaster Agricultural CEO Sarah Lancaster announces formation of Independent Agricultural Partnership Fund. Says here she's using her personal fortune to create some kind of farm support network," Tom explained excitedly. "Offering partnerships, not buyouts. And guess which farm is listed as the pilot program?" Jake's coffee grew cold as he read the article. Every word sounded like Sarah, the real Sarah he'd known during those few precious days. Her plan detailed exactly the kind of sustainable farming future they'd discussed while fixing the irrigation system. In her office, Sarah signed document after document, transferring personal assets into the new partnership fund. Her father's latest message went unopened on her phone. She didn't need to read it to know what it said. "You're really doing this?" Michelle asked, watching her sign away millions. Sarah thought of Jake's face when he talked about his family's legacy, of the community that had protected her without even knowing who she was, of the real value she'd discovered in those few days on the farm. "No," she said firmly, "I'm finally doing something real." The storm season was approaching again. Both Sarah and Jake could feel it in the air, though they were miles apart. But this time, instead of bringing destruction, the coming storm might wash away the old and help build something new, if they were brave enough to weather it together. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, an ominous echo of the night that had first brought Sarah to Jake's farm. But this storm was different, bigger, more threatening. The weather service was calling it the worst system in a decade. Jake worked frantically to secure what he could, knowing his jury-rigged repairs from the last storm wouldn't hold against this onslaught. The bank's foreclosure deadline loomed as heavy as the storm clouds, but right now, his priority was saving what crops he could. In her office, Sarah stared at the weather radar with growing alarm. The storm's projected path took it directly over Jake's farm. Over all the farms she'd come to know during her time there, her phone buzzed with a message from Michelle. "Board meeting cancelled due to weather. Your father's lawyers still want to meet about the partnership fund." Sarah ignored it, already grabbing her keys. The lawyers could wait. The crops couldn't. The first heavy drops were falling as Jake struggled with the grain storage doors. The wind was picking up, threatening to tear them from his grip. Suddenly, another pair of hands grabbed the door alongside his. He turned to find Sarah, her corporate suit already soaked through. "What are you?" he began. "Later," she cut him off. "Right now, we have work to do." They worked in sync, muscle memory from their days together taking over. No words were needed as they battled. to protect the farm from nature's fury. Sarah knew exactly where the emergency supplies were kept, remembered all the weak spots they'd identified during the last storm. The wind howled around them as they fought to secure the irrigation system. Lightning illuminated Sarah's face, and Jake saw none of the corporate CEO there, only the woman who had worked beside him in these fields, who understood what this land meant. "The North Field!" Jake shouted over the storm. "The drainage system won't hold." They raced through the deluge, Sarah not even noticing the mud destroying her designer shoes. The drainage ditch was already overflowing, threatening to flood the entire field. Without thinking, they fell into their old rhythm, Jake digging, while Sarah engineered an emergency runoff using pieces of scrap metal and the knowledge she'd gained during her stay. "Just like last time," she said, securing a makeshift barrier. "Last time you were pretending to be someone else," Jake replied, but there was no bite in his words. "No," Sarah met his eyes through the rain. "Last time I was discovering who I really am." A massive thunderclap interrupted them. The storm was directly overhead now, its full fury bearing down on the farm. They could hear trees cracking in the distance. The barn roof, Jake suddenly remembered. The west corner was weak. They were running before he finished the sentence. The barn door fought them, wind trying to tear it from their grasp. Inside, rain was already pouring through a growing gap in the roof. Without hesitation, Sarah climbed the ladder to the loft, Jake right behind her. Working together, they managed to secure a tarp over the worst of the damage. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene. The CEO and the farmer side by side again, fighting to save this piece of land that had come to mean everything to both of them. "I saw what you did," Jake said as they descended. "The partnership fund, using your own money to save the farms." "It's not enough," Sarah admitted. "The board's fighting me every step of the way. My father's trying to have me declared mentally unfit for corporate leadership." She turned to face him. "But I don't care. Everything I said about changing things, I meant it, even if I have to build something entirely new." The storm raged outside, but in that moment, something shifted between them. Jake saw the truth in her eyes. This wasn't some corporate player having a charitable moment. This was someone who had genuinely been transformed by her time here, who was risking everything to save what she'd come to believe in. "I know you meant it," he said softly. "I think I knew all along. I was just scared," Sarah offered. "So was I. Scared of admitting who I really was, scared of changing everything I thought I knew." She gestured at the storm around them. "But sometimes it takes a storm to show us what really matters." Thunder crashed overhead, but neither of them flinched. They were too focused on each other, on this moment of truth that had been building since that first stormy night. The storm's fury gradually subsided, leaving behind a transformed landscape and two people who had been transformed along with it. Jake and Sarah sat on his porch steps, exhausted but alive with possibility, watching the clouds break apart to reveal the first hints of dawn. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, running a hand through her rain-soaked hair. "What if we combined our knowledge? Your farming expertise, my business experience, not as corporate takeover and family farm, but as true partners." Jake turned to look at her, really look at her. The woman who had arrived in designer clothes and was now covered in mud, who had traded corporate power for something more meaningful. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah's eyes lit up with the same passion he'd seen when they'd first discussed sustainable farming. "A new model. The partnership fund I created, it's not just about saving farms, it's about revolutionizing how they work. Modern efficiency meeting generational wisdom." She stood up, pacing as she outlined her vision. "Imagine a network of family farms, each maintaining their independence, but sharing resources, technology, and market access. My business connections could open up premium markets for organic produce, sustainable farming certificates, farm-to-table programs, while we provide the actual farming expertise," Jake continued, catching her enthusiasm. The knowledge that can't be learned in boardrooms. Exactly. Sarah turned to him, eyes shining. The board doesn't understand. The real value isn't in acquiring farms, it's in partnering with them, creating something sustainable for future generations. Jake stood up, moving closer to her. And your father, the board, they'll fight this. Every step of the way. Let them, Sarah said firmly. I've already transferred my controlling shares to the partnership fund. They can have Lancaster Agricultural Holdings. We'll build something better. We? Jake's voice was soft, loaded with meaning. Sarah met his gaze steadily. If you want. I know I hurt you, hiding who I was. But these past weeks have shown me who I really am, and who I want to be. Jake took her hand, calloused farm fingers intertwining with her corporate-trained ones. You know, when I first found you in that storm, I thought I was just helping a stranded traveler. Didn't expect her to end up saving my farm, and maybe showing me a better way forward. We saved each other, Sarah corrected. You showed me what really matters. I was so caught up in corporate metrics, I'd forgotten about the human element, the community, the connection to the land. Thunder rumbled in the distance, the storm moving onto other fields, other farms. But here, in this moment, something new was taking root. It won't be easy, Jake warned, building something like this from scratch, convincing other farmers to trust a new way of doing things. Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. Nothing worth doing ever is, but I think we make a pretty good team. We do, Jake agreed, pulling her closer. Corporate expertise and farming know-how, heart and mind, Sarah added softly, like the best partnerships should be. The first rays of sun broke through the clouds, painting the rain-washed farm in golden light. In the distance, they could see the crops they'd saved together, the barn they'd protected, the fields that would now become a testing ground for their shared vision. So, Jake said, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. Partners. Sarah's answer was to close the distance between them, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like coming home. When they finally parted, she smiled. In everything. Around them, the farm seemed to glow with promise. The storm had tried to destroy it, but instead had laid the groundwork for something new to grow. Much like the storm that had first brought them together, had planted the seeds of change in both their hearts. The future stretched out before them, full of challenges but also possibilities. They had found a way to bridge their worlds, to combine the best of both, and in doing so had discovered something neither of them had expected, a love rooted in the land, nurtured by shared purpose and strong enough to weather any storm.